Hi everybody, I'm Skip Elsheimer. Welcome to the AV Geeks Lunchtime Streaming Show, where we watch old 16mm films, and that was from the Mogul Brothers collection, excuse me, Trip on the Elbe River. Mogul Brothers, of course, was a film library that you could rent films from in New York City, and a lot of them ended up at the Oregon Archive in Pittsburgh, and others ended up at the Library of Congress. And supposedly there's more in New York City that we are going to try to scan, and then ultimately donate them all to the Library of Congress, because it's fascinating stuff there. But, we'll scan them and put them on our site so you get to see them before they end up there. That's the value of AV Geeks? I don't know. You get to see these obscure films from the 20s and 30s that are silent and just barely home movies. I'm not sure. Anyways, that was a type of geography film. This one is a more up-to-date, and by more up-to-date, I mean maybe 10 years later, made by Encyclopedia Britannica, featuring our good friend, narrator James Brill. So this is Peru, People of the Mountains. Enjoy.
In Lima, the capital city of Peru, centers the administration of a republic rich in historical background. Established by Pizarro more than 4 centuries ago, Lima was for years the dominant city of all South America. Even today, it is the nerve center of Peruvian politics, commerce, finance, and education. Its citizens, largely of Spanish lineage, have much in common with modern city dwellers the world over. In Lima are found the banks of international trade. Here, too, are the offices of modern business enterprise, typified by the headquarters of a telephone concern. Representative of another function of Lima in Peru's national life is the University of San Marcos, founded in 1551. A proud and impressive metropolis is Lima, with its stately homes and imposing public plazas rich in historic lore. But in the remote high Andes of Peru, there are remnants of another earlier glory, where silent, crumbled ruins bear witness to a vanished age. In these mountains once dwelt the Incas, proud rulers of a vast Indian empire. Strong and immense were the fortresses they built to guard the paths of empire from the foe. Tooled stone on tooled stone, they reared their massive citadels throughout the central Andes. The stones have endured, the stones of fortresses and of imperial dwellings. These have remained. But the civilization which flourished here vanished long ago. Long before the ships of the white men touched on South American shores, the life of a far-flung empire centered here. Advanced in the arts of war and peace, the Incas administered from mountain strongholds the affairs of a highly organized society. The Spaniard came, the Incas fell. Only ruins remain, ruins and hapless descendants of a once proud Indian people. In Cuzco, the Inca capital, a monastery now stands upon masonry, once the Inca Temple of the Sun. Where his forebears passed in proud procession, the present-day Indian makes his indifferent way. Yet Cuzco is still an Indian city. The empire passed, the people have remained. Threading narrow streets bordered by masonry reminiscent of past glory, they still adhere to ways tradition has preserved. Life goes on. The marketplace brings together those who buy and those who sell. Ever prominent are corn and the potato, which spread from Peru around the world. There are blankets woven on native looms. There are sandals made from discarded automobile tires. But far from populous Cuzco, out in the broad reaches of the plateau, are the communal Indian villages of even more traditional pattern. In one such village is the home of the Pachacutic family, a dwelling of adobe, thatching, and occasional patches of tile. Today, Grandfather Pachacutic sits quietly near the doorway, chewing the much relished coca leaves. The approach of a village boy leading a llama, a favorite beast of burden in the Andes, evokes but a listless response. Though, in his youth, Grandfather, too, set off on many an arduous trek to distant mountain villages. In the fields, other members of the Pachacutic family have long been busily at work. Planting is underway. The dry earth of the plateau is first turned up with primitive foot plows, plows ancient in design and used in time-honored fashion. In the wake of the foot plows, Father guides his team of oxen, making the furrows in which seeds are planted. Plodding along laboriously and slowly, the oxen draw the ancient wooden plow made from a tree fork. In the furrow, Alta, a daughter, scatters fertilizer, and Maldo, her brother, completes the planting. Plowed, fertilized, and planted, the Pachacutic fields will yield up corn and potatoes, staples grown here through long centuries. The arrival of a water carrier in the field brings a welcome pause. Poured from a native earthenware vessel into a cup, likewise a product of local handicraft, the cool water offers needed refreshment after the long morning of work in the fields. And now, with the crude tools temporarily laid aside, the family prepare for their midday meal, a meal eaten in the open, with the earth itself serving as a table. From a large earthenware pot, Mother serves out bowls of vegetable stew, in which the ever-present potatoes are a major ingredient. Following customary practice, Apuri, her son, eats the mixture without benefit of fork or spoon. Each one drinks the nourishing liquid directly from his dish. In their eating habits, as in their agricultural methods, the family reflect the ways of a people who have long lived close to the soil. Meanwhile, in a pasture not far away, the wife of Apuri tends a flock of llamas. Nor is her attention directed to the animals alone. On a small hand loom of traditional pattern, she weaves a strip of belting incorporating a conventional Indian design with varicolored yarns. Thus, in field and pasture, the Pachacutic family reveal a traditional division of labor. Likewise, those who remain in the village pursue their respective specialized tasks. Today, as in centuries past, the women of the Andes villages prepare the yarn for homespun clothing. The techniques of a machine age have yet to make their inroads here where the ancient ways suffice. Just as Apuri's wife plies her hand loom in the field, other women of the village sit all day at larger looms. With eyes intent on the work at hand, they fashion the yarn from the spindles into fabrics. Clothing must be strong and warm in the cold climate of the high Andes. Like all members of the village community, the butcher, too, has his special work. But meat is a minor part of the diet for a people who depend chiefly on potatoes and corn laboriously ground. Baker, butcher, weaver, spinner, and grinder of corn all make their contributions to the closely knit village life, a life centering largely around the marketplace. And here, as in field and home, food is the major concern. Potatoes newly harvested and others preserved through freezing are ever present. In the produce of the fields, in colorful native headgear, and in the market itself, the ancient pattern of things continues to find expression. Toward evening, Apuri's wife leads her unhurried flock back across the tranquil plateau to the village. From the village in the morning to the village at night. Such is the rhythm of routine for those of the community who till the soil or tend the flocks of llamas. Another day will bring another repetition of the old familiar round followed in the village through the years. The plows put aside today will be taken up once more on tomorrow's return to the fields. Corralled for the night close by the living quarters of the family itself, the llamas will wait another day of grazing in pastures centuries old. For a season, most of the men of the village depart to work in mines or on plantations. They leave the women to climb the rugged slopes to work in the fields. It is the women who bring the village crops to maturity among the high Andean mountains. They are aided in this work by native llamas and by sturdy, plodding burros, reminiscent of the Spanish conquest centuries ago. At harvest time, across the bridge that leads to the outside world, men of the village begin returning home from their work in the white men's mines and plantations. In this return to their ancestral mountain homes, they answer the age-old call of the clan. Reunion with their families, sharing together the harvest from the soil. From strange places of the outside world, gifts are brought back for the women folk and experiences of past months recounted. The celebration includes a pilgrimage to Cuzco, where natives from the surrounding mountains come for marketing and for friendly reunions. To Cuzco, built about the imposing cathedral, whose tower has sent out its call through the centuries. Centuries since the white man brought a new religion to the land of the children of the sun. In Cuzco's marketplace, the visitors gather to buy, to sell, to barter. Here, elders from the villages meet to exchange local gossip and to chew the popular coca leaves. In their faces is the story of a people who have survived centuries after a Spanish conquest, a people with the heritage of an ancient Indian culture, whose glories are dimly echoed in many a crumbling ruin set starkly against the eternal Andes.
Somebody pointed out this was a ERPI film, and ERPI stood for, what is it, Electrical Research, something, Western Electric. Let's see if I can look it up while we're talking, because that's really what we do. Nowadays it stands for Enterprise Resource Performance Incorporated, but that's not what it is. ERPI, Electrical Research Products Incorporated. And at one point I saw a film that credited W.E. ERPI. I was like, is that someone's name? No, W.E. stands for Western Electric. But what happened was when Encyclopedia Britannica got acquired by University of Chicago, they bought it from Sears, Sears Roebuck. They started realizing that educational films were of value, and so what they did is they actually bought the ERPI, most of the ERPI films, and then the Emerson films, I think, and maybe some of the Eastman Teaching films, and then they started their own brand, and they brought James Brill with them. So James Brill was the voice of Encyclopedia Britannica for quite a while. Let's see. So behind me is a film scanner. We got a film set up. And that's when the title is River's Home. But I watched a little bit of it. I don't really know what this is about. So that's why we watch these films. So here's River's Home. Enjoy.
course, energy, all energy comes from sunlight. And the ocean has its whole flock of organisms, the plankton, the algae of the ocean that produce energy from the sun. In a marsh like this, you can see a tremendous amount of energy being produced from the sun. The grass is growing tremendously, and it will produce a lot of energy. And this energy is excess because in the sense that it is not used here.
This is how Dr. Charles Krebs, marine biologist, experiences the world of the marsh.
The ocean itself has to depend on its energy from the land. Most of the nutrients that go into the ocean come originally from the land, obviously. They're then used and reused and recycled and used. The energy flows constantly. I'm looking across it and seeing the different textures and colors, which are, to me, a very aesthetic experience. I can see the commercial value in it, but I am most impressed myself with the aesthetic values. I enjoy observing birds, mating. I enjoy observing birds fishing and watching eels swim and seeing crabs fight. It provides a home for a lot of animals that I enjoy observing. It provides a setting to put these animals in. Originally, as this was a shallow embayment. From the very beginning of the time of the marsh, it was quite a dynamic interaction with the Spartina alterniflora, the high Spartina, the high marsh grass, moving along the edges of a shallow embayment, and by their resistance to the salt water, their ability to spread by rhizomes, which are horizontal roots. So they send out a root, and then they send up shoots all along that root. By spreading seaward and then, of course, slowing down the water, dropping the sediment, causing a buildup of sediment, raising the ground higher, they could then keep. Map, say, of a marsh, you will see that it looks very much like a human sweat gland under a microscope. It has usually one or two major channels going into it, and this breaks down repeatedly to form many small channels, and these are in turn draining in many small ponds. And each one of these small ponds, these shallow water habitats with very rich nutrients, with a lot of things growing, provide the home, or the nursery, you might say, of a lot of young fish. During low tides, numbers of small mullet and striped bass that are in the large channels and just offshore, and then as the tides come in, they come in and feed on the younger and smaller fish that are in the marsh.
a river has two potentials as a river. Has an aesthetic potential, just being there.
There's some tension issues with this, and I know this is going to break your heart, but we're going to move on to another film. What is uniform motion?
This jet is traveling with a uniform motion. What does that mean? It means two things. One, that the jet is traveling in a straight line. And two, that the speed of the jet isn't changing. Let's see if this car is traveling with a uniform motion. Is it moving in a straight line? Yes, it seems to be. Is it traveling at a speed that doesn't change? Yes, it is. The car is moving in a straight line, and it's moving at an unchanging speed. That means it's moving with a uniform motion. What if the car continues traveling with this uniform motion for several hours? How far will it go each hour? Well, it seems logical to think that it should travel 60 miles every hour. When an object is traveling with a uniform motion, it travels equal distances in equal times. In this case, 60 miles each hour. We can prove that. This is a bag of chalk dust. The chalk bag will hit the road once every time the wheel makes a complete turn. So the distance between chalk marks is the distance the car travels each time the wheel makes a complete turn. If we measure between the chalk marks, we find that every time the wheel turns around once, the car travels the same distance. Now we substitute a light for the bag of chalk dust. Every time the light hits its lowest point, the wheel has made a complete turn. That means that the car travels the same distance between every two successive low points of the light. The speed is holding steady. And the car is traveling in a straight line. That means that it's traveling with a uniform motion. And that should mean that it's traveling equal distances in equal times. Is it? You can tell by the rhythm that each turn of the wheel takes the same amount of time. And we've already seen that each turn of the wheel measures off an equal distance. So the car is traveling equal distances in equal times. You can check that for yourself by watching the dotted lines go by. These lines are painted on the highway equal distances apart. They're going by at a regular rhythm. The car is traveling with a uniform motion. An object traveling with a uniform motion travels equal distances in equal times. Why is it important to know about uniform motion? It's important because the natural way for an object to move is with a uniform motion. For example, this rocket is traveling with a uniform motion. As a matter of fact, the men guiding this rocket could make it travel in a straight line, moving at an almost unchanging speed for years and years without ever turning the motor on again. That may be hard to believe, but we can prove that it's true. To start an object moving, you need a force, a push, for instance. On the other hand, once an object is moving, it has a tendency to keep moving. In fact, once you're moving, it's sometimes hard to stop. But the curious thing is that even if you hadn't run into the gentleman, eventually you would have slowed down and stopped anyhow. Now, just as it takes a force to start an object moving, it also takes a force to slow a moving object down. What force is slowing you down now? The car will stay motionless until some force moves it. The force of the motor is moving the car now. Now the motor is no longer supplying a force to make the car move, but the car continues moving. Why? Because a moving object has a tendency to keep moving, even if a force is no longer pushing it. But eventually the moving object does stop. Why? A force stops it. That force is friction. This surface is covered with sandpaper. The bottom of the wooden block is also covered with sandpaper. A force starts the wooden block moving, but it doesn't move far. It's stopped by friction. The friction is caused because the two surfaces are rough. As one surface moves past the other, the rough parts hit against each other. Here's a polished metal weight. It's so smooth you can see your face in it. This surface is also polished metal. What stopped the weight? Friction? These two surfaces are polished smooth. How could there be friction between them? This is the surface of a polished piece of metal seen through a microscope. It's far from smooth. There are no surfaces so smooth that there won't be some friction if they are rubbed together. We can reduce friction by lubrication. This is a lubricating oil. It moves farther, but still friction stops it. Here are two smooth surfaces, plastic and polished wood. But they're not so smooth that there's no friction between them. With the balloon added, there seems to be much less friction between the plastic and the wood. Air from the balloon is coming out of this hole. The plastic disc is actually resting on a thin cushion of this air. See how easy it is to slide a piece of paper in and out? The air doesn't make the disc move, but it does provide lubrication. There will be very little friction now between the plastic disc and the surface of the bowling alley. How does an object move when there is very little friction to slow it down? It moves in a straight line and with a fairly steady speed. It moves, in other words, with an almost uniform motion. Until there is a force to stop it. A human cannonball is a moving object, but he doesn't travel with a uniform motion. First of all, he's slowed down by friction with the air. And he doesn't travel in a straight line either. That's because the force of gravity is constantly pulling him down towards the earth. What would happen to the human cannonball if there were no friction and no gravity on Earth? If there were no friction with the air to slow him down, and if there were no gravity to pull him towards the Earth, he would travel in a straight line at an unchanging speed. That is to say, he would travel with uniform motion. What happens to the rocket when the engine is turned off? Now there's no force pushing on the rocket, making it go forward. But like all moving objects, the rocket tends to continue moving. And out here, there's almost nothing to slow it down or cause it to change its direction. There's practically no atmosphere to rub against and cause friction. And there's not enough gravity to pull hard enough on the rocket to force it to change its direction. And so the rocket continues moving ahead with an almost uniform motion. The energy of the rocket motor is used to produce force to push the rocket up against friction with the Earth's atmosphere and up against the force of the Earth's gravity. Once the rocket is free from friction with air and relatively free of the pull of gravity, the motor can be shut off. And the rocket will continue to travel with a uniform motion for millions of miles. It will keep coasting like that until it meets some force that slows it down.
That last bit about the human cannonball. I mean, any film that has human cannonball footage in it, big fan. So while we're in space, because we don't have gravity or friction, let's learn a little bit about space navigation, thanks to NASA. Enjoy.
On Earth, we move between points which remain fixed relative to each other. But in our solar system, all bodies are in continuous motion. Man has long observed the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets. He's measured angles and distances, calculated gravitational forces and the shapes of orbits. This was limited only by technology. The sharper tools of the 20th century have allowed him to measure the movements of the sun and the planets with reference to other stars in our galaxy. And now he leaves Earth on journeys into space. Eventually, man will set out toward another planet, millions of miles distant. The instruments and techniques of modern science will guide his spacecraft with an accuracy and precision inconceivable to Earth-bound navigators. Though the spacecraft will be traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, it will seem to the men on board to be hanging motionless. For them, the stars will be fixed in their positions. There will be no day or night. The receding Earth will not remain behind them, but will be imperceptibly moving ahead. Where they left Earth, there is now only a point in space. If their objective is Mars, for example, they will not be moving directly toward it, but along a curving path, leading them to another point in space beyond the sun. They must arrive at that point at the same time as Mars. Neither they nor the planet can stop and wait. On this trip, an error in injection velocity at Earth of less than 0.1%, that's about 25 miles per hour, will, if it goes uncorrected, cause the craft to miss Mars by over 1/3 of a million miles. The additional propellant and time required to correct so large an error near the end of the trip might be prohibitive. The mission would likely fail. But errors in spaceflight can be corrected during flight because the principles of space navigation are based on the knowledge that the forces involved are constant and predictable. In our solar system, each planet is locked into its orbit around the sun by its particular velocity, the planet's momentum being balanced by the sun's gravitational pull. The inner planets, where the pull is greatest, travel at greater speeds than the outer planets, where the pull is weaker. If a spacecraft is to leave the Earth for another planet, it must increase or decrease the speed imparted to it by the orbiting Earth. Yet, either way, this velocity change is a fraction of the orbital speed of the Earth, 66,000 miles an hour. The velocity imparted by the Earth also puts the spacecraft into the ecliptic plane. That's the plane of the Earth's orbit. It would take the expenditure of considerable energy to get out of that plane. Fortunately, all planets move in planes very close to the ecliptic, and they all orbit in the same direction. Unlike the planets, a spacecraft can change its orbit and its direction because it can change its velocity. When a spacecraft escapes the Earth's gravity in the same direction as the Earth's travel around the sun, its greater momentum around the sun overbalances the sun's pull, throwing the spacecraft outward. But the sun's steady pull eventually slows the craft's outward flight, and here, unless it can boost its speed, it will start to fall inward. On the other hand, if the spacecraft leaves the Earth at the same speed as before, but in a direction opposite to the Earth's travel, it reduces its own velocity around the sun, permitting the sun to pull it gradually inward. But as it falls, it gains speed. This increasing momentum will throw it outward again unless it can reduce its speed. It is a controlled velocity change which alters the course of an orbiting body. In this voyage to Mars, the path the spacecraft should follow has been computed. But putting the craft on exactly the right path cannot be done. Even the most sophisticated launching rocket controls can't avoid small inaccuracies in launching or account for the uncertainties in the orbits of the Earth and planets. There will always be a small error to be corrected. The first correction will compensate for most of this error. A small velocity change made early in the voyage will have a much greater effect than the same change made later. Later corrections will remove residual errors and refine the trajectory of the craft. Fundamental to all navigation is the ability to measure angles. For this, man in space uses a sextant, a device he's been using for over 200 years. With this instrument, the astronaut measures precisely the angle between a planet and a known star. This is recorded along with the exact time of the sighting. This angle defines a cone of position because the angle between the planet and the star could have been sighted from any point on the surface of that cone. But one sighting will not tell him where. The astronaut does know he is near his desired trajectory. His approximate speed, elapsed time, and limits of possible error locate him within a football-shaped volume which navigators call the estimated ellipsoid of position. The space where this ellipsoid intersects the cone establishes his position more closely, in an area where the two coincide. From this, he knows about how far he is from his desired trajectory. Repeated sightings will be made to reduce the amount of uncertainty until the actual trajectory is determined within the allowable limits. If it does not coincide with the desired one, the astronaut must perform a mid-course correction to put his craft on a corrected trajectory. A more precise method for determining position uses 3 sightings from separate known bodies. The 3 cone-shaped surfaces intersect and establish a point of position. Actually, throughout the flight, Earth-based tracking information will be used to correct or supplement onboard navigation, so long as it can supply sufficiently accurate data. But as the spacecraft nears the target position, millions of miles from Earth's tracking stations, the astronaut will have to rely to a much greater extent on his onboard navigational equipment. Any backup information from Earth would take 12 minutes to travel the 134 million miles that separate them. He will determine the exact location of his craft with respect to the planet, using sextant sightings, this time between the target planet and known stars. Now he can calculate the final velocity changes that will put him in a precise parking orbit around the planet. Once determined, these velocity changes are applied, and an orbit around the planet is attained. The astronaut will then use his sextant to track landmarks. This confirms his parking orbit and determines its characteristics, permitting him to plan a descent trajectory. In all space operations, man's tools are of utmost importance. They consist of information-gathering devices, both optical and electronic, timekeeping devices, and computers. For manned space navigation, the information-gathering devices are the most varied. They include sextants, or other optical instruments, to measure angles between celestial bodies. Onboard radar and other electronic equipment for position determination and tracking. Earth-based radio and radar for precise distance and velocity measurements. And inertial sensing and measuring equipment to provide a reference frame for positioning the vehicle during mid-course correction and to control the corrective maneuvers. Accurate timekeeping and time recording are done electronically to an accuracy of 1/10 billionth of a second. The computers, on board and Earth-based, use both stored information and that furnished them by the measuring and sensing devices. They process at a high speed the large number of involved calculations necessary during all phases of a journey. They can solve in seconds problems which would take an experienced navigator an entire voyage to calculate. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration is engaged in the design and development of these devices and at the procedures and techniques for their use. Studies are underway to determine what navigation functions can best be performed by man in space and which functions should be automatic or Earth-based. Automatic on-board star tracking equipment developed for unmanned spacecraft will be available to supplement manned equipment. Deep space tracking equipment and methods are now so accurate that spacecraft can be guided to the moon and the near planets with remarkable accuracy. For example, Mariner 2, on its mission to Venus, traversed 180 million miles of space and was placed within 12,000 miles of its target center. This is like shooting at a moving target from a platform that is moving and rotating at a range of 1 mile and hitting the target 4 1/4 inches from dead center. Later, Ranger 7 hit the moon within 8 miles of its aiming point, 1.5 inches miss at 1 mile. Ranger 9 came closer, impacting only 2 3/4 miles from its target center. Mariner 4 came even closer. Traveling 325 million miles, Mariner 4 swept past Mars within 2,000 miles of its aiming point. And the very first surveyor, Surveyor 1, soft landed on the moon within 9 miles of its target center. A remarkable first attempt. These historic space flights are great technological achievements. They're skillful demonstrations of the reliability and accuracy of Earth-based tracking techniques. But we're still working on the considerable problems of landing on a planet within an accuracy of 10 miles. At the same time, even more effort is being directed toward simplification of both equipment and methods. In manned flight, studies are underway to determine how on-board and Earth-based systems can best work together with the aim of reducing on-board equipment as much as possible. We're constantly improving our knowledge of the planet's masses, their orbits, distances from the sun, so that trajectories can be computed more accurately. We are developing trajectory equations that can be solved by simplified computers, which will still provide navigational data to the degree of reliability needed for manned flight to the planets. Development of new optical techniques for angular measurements are being explored. These may enable a navigator to get accurate information with handheld sextants. Our knowledge is constantly being increased by missions like Gemini. In practicing, we'll gain experience in measuring angles, distances, and relative velocities, and in determining the changes needed to attain specific trajectories. From actual experience, we may be able to make improvements in future systems that we cannot now foresee or predict. Systems development in our most ambitious project to date, the Apollo moon flight, is well underway. The guidance and navigation station aboard the Apollo is equipped with a scanning telescope, a sextant, a digital computer, and an inertial measurement unit. Attitude and guidance controls can be operated directly by the navigator or automatically by the computer at the direction of the navigator. This complete system permits all navigation for the lunar journey to be performed on board independent of Earth-based tracking or computing facilities if necessary. The navigator will make repeated sightings to confirm his position and trajectory. However, throughout the entire lunar trip, he will have Earth-based tracking information available for use in his own computer. This is how the onboard equipment works. The line of sight of the scanning telescope is fixed to the spacecraft. Looking through this scope, the navigator acquires the Earth and a selected star. He maneuvers the spacecraft until the Earth landmark is centered at 0. Rotation of the telescope reticle till it falls across the star also turns the sextant. He notes the angle of the star and sets the sextant at that angle. Now, looking through the sextant, both images will appear enlarged and superimposed. When they are lined up, he pushes the mark button. This feeds the precise time and angle information into the computer. The computer also receives Earth-based tracking data, which when combined with the observed data, keeps the navigator informed of his current position and actual trajectory. The navigator instructs the computer to make the necessary trajectory correction. It determines the exact amount and direction of thrust needed to accomplish this correction. The inertial measurement unit furnishes a sense of direction to the computer, enabling the spacecraft to be correctly oriented. The rocket is fired. The inertial measurement unit measures the acceleration, feeding this data to the computer. When the desired speed change is accomplished, the computer cuts off the engine, and now the spacecraft is on its corrected course. More than one correction may be needed. As the moon is approached, sextant readings will be made between known lunar landmarks and appropriate stars to determine the final course correction. Both onboard and Earth-based computers determine independently what maneuver is required to place the Apollo craft into a lunar orbit. The familiar landmark tracking technique is then used to confirm the parking orbit, putting man for the first time in a position to land on extraterrestrial ground. The navigational experience gained in the Apollo program will contribute information needed for trips of greater complexity. For man is not content unless he's pressing himself to the limits of his knowledge or beyond.
1967. Yeah, so before we landed on the moon, but there were definitely Saturn tests that were taking place that there was footage from. I very much like these films that were made before we actually landed on the moon because it talks about all the considerations, all the work, just the vast amount of information. And back in the day, when I was tentatively tapped to digitize a bunch of NASA material, I really wanted to do as much as possible to show all that stuff, to kind of show their work, that it wasn't just, oh yeah, they just launched a rocket and then they're on the moon, because what that happens is that people look at that and they're like, oh well, it's fake, because they keep looking at the same footage. They don't look at the vast amount of information that was gathered and created to get to the moon. So that was my take on it, but it was not a funded project, so I didn't get to really do as much as I wanted. This film, I think, was actually at NC State's library, and I scanned it for them for free because I was just interested in that. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, hit the thumbs up, the like. You can also buy us coffee. William bought us some coffee. Thank you for that. You can go to ko-fi.com/avgeeks to buy us coffee, or go to patreon.com/avgeeks to support us. And also, there's a super thanks button if you're watching on YouTube. But thanks for tuning in today. We'll be back again tomorrow. There's going to be maybe a special guest, and then later an evening, a special show of Dr. Irwin Moon versus Irene Moon. Our favorite sermons from science guy versus entomologist, performance artist. So that'll be fun. That's going to be at 6 o'clock tomorrow, Friday. Yeah. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you tomorrow. Everybody take care.